Hi everyone, my name is C.Mendez, and the topic I'm going to be going over today is gender dysphoria. Now, before we begin, some important terms and distinctions. The area of sex and gender are highly controversial. The DSM-V used the terms sex and sexual to refer to the biological indicators of male and female, understood in the context of reproductive capacity. Gender is used to denote the public and usually legally recognized lived role as boy or girl, man or woman, but in contrast to certain social constructionist theories, biological factors are seen as contributing in interaction with social and psychological factors to gender development. A few terms to note are gender assignment, the initial assignment at birth of male or female; gender reassignment, an official and legal change of gender; gender identity, social identity, and refers to an individual's identification as male or female; gender dysphoria, discomfort or distress an individual experiences because of the incongruence between expressed gender and assigned gender; transgender, broad spectrum of individuals who identify with a gender different from their natal gender; and transsexual, an individual who seeks or has undergone a social transition, which may include sex reassignment surgery. Now, for gender dysphoria, it can be broken down into two diagnostic categories. It can be given to children, and it can also be given to adolescents and adults. Gender dysphoria in children is 302.6/F64.2, and the diagnostic criteria consists of criterion A, which is a marked incongruence between one's experienced/expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration as manifested by at least 6 of the following, one of which must be criterion A1. So A1 is a strong desire to be of the other gender or an insistence that one is the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. 2. In boys, assigned gender, a strong preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire, or in girls, assigned gender, a strong preference for wearing only typical masculine clothing and a strong resistance to the wearing of typical feminine clothing. 3. A strong preference for cross-gender roles in make-believe play or fantasy play. 4. A strong preference in the toys, games, or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. 5. A strong preference for playmates of the other gender. 6. In boys, assigned gender, a strong rejection of the typically masculine toys, games, and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play. Or in girls, assigned gender, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, and activities. 7. A strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. 8. A strong desire for primary and or secondary sex characteristics that match one's experienced gender. And criterion B includes the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, school, or other important areas of functioning. Gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults, 302.85/F64.1. The diagnostic criteria and diagnostic criterion A is a marked incongruence between one's experienced/expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration as manifested by at least 2 of the following. So it's important to note one of the distinctions already between children, adolescents, and adults is that only 2 of symptoms are required for a diagnosis in adolescents and adults, and it does not have to be criterion A1 like it would in children. A marked incongruence between one's experienced and expressed gender and primary and or secondary sex characteristics, or in young adolescents, the anticipated sex characteristics. 2. A strong desire to be rid of one's primary and or secondary sex characteristics because of marked incongruence with one's experienced/expressed gender, or in young adolescents, a desire to prevent the development of the anticipated sex secondary characteristics. 3. A strong desire for primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender. 4. A strong desire to be of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. 5. A strong desire to be treated as the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. 6. A strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. And criterion B, the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So some specifiers include in children, adolescents, and adults with a disorder of sex development, which can include congenital adrenogenital disorder and congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which are 2 genetic conditions that limit the production of hormones in the adrenal glands, and they both affect growth and development. And then androgen insensitivity syndrome includes a condition that affects individuals before birth and during puberty, where they may produce signs of both male and female sexual development. And in adolescents and adults post-transition, which includes the individual has transitioned to full-time living in the desired gender with or without legalization of gender change, and has undergone or is preparing to have at least one cross-sex medical procedure or treatment regimen, namely regular cross-sex hormone treatment or gender reassignment surgery confirming the desired gender. So these can include penectomies and vaginoplasty in natal males, and a mastectomy or a phalloplasty in a natal female. The prevalence. For natal adult males, prevalence ranges from 0.005% to 0.014%, and for natal adult females, the prevalence ranges from 0.002% to 0.003%. Since not all adults seeking hormone treatment and surgical reassignment attend specialty clinics, these rates are likely modest underestimates, and the literature does point that out. Many individuals with, not many, but a fraction of the individuals with gender dysphoria do not seek out medical treatment or psychological treatment, so these underestimates are noted in the literature. Sex differences in the rates of referrals to specialty clinics vary by age groups. So in children, the sex ratio of natal boys to girls range from 2 to 1 to 4.5 to 1. And in adolescents and adults, sex ratio of natal males to females range from 1 to 1 to 6.1 to 1. The course. So expression of gender dysphoria varies with age. There are separate criteria sets for children versus adolescents and adults, which we went over. The criteria for children are defined in a more concrete behavioral manner than those for adolescents and adults. Young children are less likely than older children, adolescents, and adults to express extreme and persistent anatomic dysphoria. In adolescents and adults, incongruence between experienced gender and somatic sex is a central feature of the diagnosis. And factors related to distress or impairment can also vary with age. So a very young child may show signs of distress, whether it's intense crying or tantruming, only when the parent tells the child that he or she is not really a member of the other gender, but only desires to be. Cultural considerations include individuals with gender dysphoria have been reported across many countries and cultures. Several countries, the US, the UK, Poland, Japan, and Germany, have conducted studies into diagnostic features, prevalence rates, and course. A few of them are listed in my handout. It's actually very interesting to see the comparison between diagnostic features and prevalence rates because more and more studies are trying to analyze it from different perspectives. The equivalence of gender dysphoria has also been reported in individuals living in cultures with institutionalized gender categories other than male and female, but it is unclear whether these individuals would meet the criteria for gender dysphoria. So, comorbidity. Clinically referred children with gender dysphoria show elevated rates of emotional and behavioral problems. Most commonly, these problems are anxiety, disruptive and impulse control, and depressive disorders. In prepubertal children, increasing age is associated with having more behavioral or emotional problems that is related to the increasing non-acceptance of gender-variant behavior by others. In older children, gender-variant behavior often leads to peer ostracism, which leads to more behavioral problems. So it becomes a very circular thing. ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is more prevalent in clinically referred children with gender dysphoria than in the general population. I thought this was interesting because there is already a set of problems with ASD. So to add this as a comorbid diagnosis, but the literature does support that this is much more common than in the general population. And I also included 2 articles on this subject in my handout as well. Clinically referred adults with gender dysphoria may have coexisting mental health problems, most common anxiety and depressive disorders. So you start to see that whether it's children, adolescents, or adults, the most common comorbid diagnosis is either anxiety and or depressive disorders. The history. So in the DSM-3 published in the 1980s, it was first introduced as transsexualism, which is defined as the incongruence between anatomic sex and gender identity. The term transsexualism or transsexual is still used in literature today, often interchangeable with gender dysphoria. And gender identity disorder in children, DIDC, in the psychosexual disorders category. So in the DSM-3R, published in 1987, gender identity disorder in children was expanded to include the disorder first evident in infancy, childhood, or adolescence. In the DSM-4, published in 1994, introduction of gender identity disorder, GID, in adults, which caused this diagnosis to be moved to the sexual and gender identity disorders category. So the DSM-4 actually caused a focus. the focus to shift from identity to behavior. And a lot of the literature highlights that when diagnosing an individual with gender dysphoria, the behavior is much more now what we're focusing on. So after the DSM-4 in 94 and the DSM-4-TR in 2000, there was strong debate about the inclusion of GID in the current climate and the social stigma associated with mental disorders. The DSM-5, published in 2013, encompasses the clinical distress of gender incongruence while assigning its own section as a disorder. So it's located in the DSM-5, page 451, as its own category with its own subsection and all. So the etiology includes, from a neuroanatomical standpoint, differences in brain structure and brain function that are related to gender and sexual orientation have been found to be associated with pathoetiology of gender dysphoria. Sexual differentiation of the genitals takes place in the first trimester of pregnancy, and sexual differentiation of the brain starts during the second half of pregnancy. So a current hypothesis is that these two processes may play roles independently of each other that predispose an individual to transsexuality. One working hypothesis behind GD is that the neuronautical differentiation in the hypothalamic networks is altered. Several studies are currently looking into this, and it's interesting to see how at such a young age, even in development, from a developmental perspective, how we can start to see these differences. Childhood maltreatment, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, psychiatric associations or comorbid diagnoses, ASD and schizophrenia are continuously mentioned in the literature. Role of endocrine disruptors, a hypothesized role for endocrine disruptors, specifically phthalates, which are seen in some plastics, and there has been an increased contamination in the environment in recent years, so this is also believed to have a role. And genetics. Genetic association has been proposed. Heritability of GD is suggested by evidence that has shown the familiarity of transsexualism among siblings and an increased concordance for transsexualism in monozygotic as compared with dizygotic same-sex twins. However, all of the literature does point that there is no specific etiology. It remains unclear whether research is going to find one, but there's strong evidence to support a complex biopsychosocial etiology. And as proposed in much of what I've just gone over, it's kind of clear to see why. So assessments. Traditionally, it included the MMPI, and it had a gender subscale, the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Interview, the Masculine Gender Identity and Female Scale, the Utrecht Gender Dysphoria Scale, Gender Identity and Gender Dysphoria Questionnaire for Adolescents and Adults, Cross-Gender Questionnaire, Recall Childhood Gender Identity / Gender Role Questionnaires. These are some more of the traditional forms. Again, it's a lot of questionnaire and survey based. New Age, however, which we go into here, includes a much more Likert type scale, which allows for self-reflection. So Gender Identity Reflection and Rumination Scale, it's a 4-point Likert scale. Gender Minority and Stress and Resilience Scale, a subscale score only. Strength of Transgender Identity Scale, 7-point Likert scale. A Transgender Adaptation and Integration Measure, a 4-point Likert scale, and Transgender Positive and Identity Measure, a 7-point Likert scale. It's interesting to note that the previous assessments were all a little bit outdated, and these include from 2006 and on. Most of them are 2010 and on, so it's interesting to see how far research has come since the publication of the DSM-5. And even from the beginning with the DSM-3 when this disorder was first introduced. So differential diagnoses include nonconformity to gender roles. The diagnosis is not meant to merely describe nonconformity to stereotypical gender role behavior. So tomboyism in girls or girly boy behavior in boys and occasional cross-dressing in adult men. Transvestic disorder, it is occasionally accompanied by gender dysphoria, but it has to cause distress or impairment without drawing their primary gender into question. Body dysmorphic disorder, an individual with BDD focuses on the alteration or removal of a specific body part because it is perceived as abnormal, not because it represents a repudiated assigned gender. Schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, in the absence of psychotic symptoms, insistence by an individual with gender dysphoria that he or she is of some other gender is not considered a delusion. However, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders and gender dysphoria may co-occur, and other clinical presentations. So treatment, we have physical intervention, which include cross-sex hormone treatment, testosterone or estrogen, genital surgery, sex reassignment surgery or SRS. Psychological interventions for children includes individual psychotherapy, counseling, family therapy, parental support groups. Physical intervention is rarer in children because of the development that is still ongoing. So it is usually people in the medical field will advise against physical intervention until late adolescence, early adulthood. And psychological intervention for adults includes individual psychotherapy, counseling, family therapy, peer support groups, and speech and language therapy, which is used to help alter the voice to match the pitch and tone of the desired gender. This is more new age. Research on this particular type of therapy for individuals with gender dysphoria, I believe the earliest I saw it in the literature was 2005. So it's interesting to see. My case presentation. So Jessie is an 8-year-old girl who, from the time she could speak, strongly identified as a boy. Her parents have tried to explain otherwise, but she remains unconvinced. Jessie refuses to wear dresses or anything slightly associated with girl attire and prefers t-shirts, jeans, and a ball cap. When playing with her friends, Jessie insists on being a king or a knight who will save her friends from danger. She prefers to be surrounded by boys. She is a big basketball, football, and baseball fan and plays with her friends. She has little desire to play with girls as they do not like the toys or games she likes. At her recent birthday party, her aunt gave her a pink purse, which was followed by a tearful reaction as to why they would give her that. The older Jessie gets, the more stress she is beginning to experience in school and other social settings. Jessie is suffering from gender dysphoria in children, 302.6/F64.2. This would be a case breakdown as to why. So she meets A1, which is a strong desire to be of the other gender or insistence that one is the other gender. And remember, with gender dysphoria in children, A1 has to be met. A2 in girls, assigned gender, a strong preference for wearing only typical masculine clothing and a strong resistance to wearing typical feminine clothing. So Jessie refuses to wear any dresses or anything slightly associated with girl attire and has her preferences. A3, a strong preference for cross-gender roles and make-believe play or fantasy play. You can see that when she insists on being a king or a knight who will save her friends. A4, a strong preference for toys, games, or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. She is a big basketball, football, and baseball fan and plays with her friends. A5, a strong preference for playmates of the other gender. She prefers to be surrounded by boys and has little desires to be with girls. A6, in girls, assigned gender, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, or activities. At her recent birthday party, when her aunt gave her a pink purse, there was a tearful reaction and not really understanding as to why. Then criterion B1, the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, school, or other important areas of functioning. The older Jessie gets, the more distress she is starting to experience in school and other social settings. So Jessie meets the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria in children diagnoses. 6 out of 6 criterions for A are needed and are met, and criterion B, 1 out of 1 is needed and met. A differential diagnosis could include other specifies anxiety disorder, 300.9/F41.8. However, more of the distress would need to be experienced by Jessie for this diagnosis to be given as well, or instead. So my discussion question for all of you. Children, adolescents, and adults diagnosed with gender dysphoria often receive a comorbid diagnosis of anxiety and depressive disorders. Why do you think this may be? What role do you think cultural, social, and/or socioeconomic status play in the development of these additional disorders? I look forward to all of your responses and to replying to all of your responses. And these are some of the references which are also included in your handout. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a great week.